It's a 4-cylinder motor, not a 2. Got some of the classic ProStar tenets to it, so it's still a dual overhead cam, 4-valve per cylinder engine. Bore spacing actually, or bore size, is a 93 millimeter bore, 73.5 millimeter stroke, so same as what you'd find on like an XP 1000. Multiply that by 4, you get up to 1997 cc's or a 2-liter motor, right? We have gotten a lot of questions from people like, is this a slingshot engine dropped in a RZR? The reality is no. There are some similarities though. So like the block, the bed plate, and the head are basically the same, but other than that, it's completely different. So visually, you'll see intake and exhaust. So exhaust is on the hot side or the driver's side. Intake's on the cold side. Those are very unique to RZR. As we go down the engine, there's quite a few other things that are unique for us. So we actually cover up the alternator belt for the off-road environment. The stacked oil plate cooler that's right down here on the bottom, that you guys can see if you're on the passenger side, is actually a thicker stack so we can transfer heat better between the oil and the coolant. We run a 10-degree cooler thermostat on the RZR application. We've got a lighter weight crank so it can rev a little more freely and quickly. The bottom end oiling system is completely different. So we've got actually a scavenged bottom end. And there's quite a bit actually in the angularity requirements of this motor. So we do a lot of baffling down low to keep all the oil at the inlet of the pickup at the sump. So even when you're going, you know, especially where you guys live up by Salt Lake area, are you guys all from that area? Colorado. But generically speaking, probably a lot of rock crawling for you guys where you're running, right? So this thing will actually be really good for sustained operation at some of those articulation angles you run into with that oiling system. We actually do hold more oil in this than previous gen models. This thing I think holds 5.5 with the filter. But you can see on the cold side is really nice, right? You got your dipstick location here. Oil filter super easy to get at. You're not draining oil all over the motor when you go to change it. And the fill port is right here in the top of the valve cover. Other nice things that you guys have probably experienced from Pro XPs, we do have a vented head on this one, so you can see the coolant line coming right out of the center of the engine on the top. Makes it so you don't get a ton of heat soak, right? So you've been riding hard, you come and park, like it can still let all that heat come out of the motor. Actually, if you look at like that coffee percolator, that's kind of how it works, and that it can vent up out of the head even when the pump's not flowing anymore. So as far as other differences, we got a 62 millimeter contour bore throttle body on this, so it's right in the front of this intake clamp. You guys can probably see it from the passenger side here. Cool thing about that contour bore on the throttle body means it's not a perfect circle. It's actually shaped a little bit different. So we can get really good idle stability, but we can also tip in and get that thing to open up really quickly to give you that smack in the pants, you know, throw you back in the seat performance. And when you guys get a chance to go out and ride, do try those throttle modes out. So we talked about them a minute ago, but we'll go through them here again quick for you. So again, all the way down is the sport throttle mode. So think of that kind of like you would a normal RZR. Like if you're used to riding a Turbo S or a Pro XP, that bottom switch setting is going to be kind of what you're used to. When you flip that switch up into the middle, for you guys that are in those rocky areas where you're doing that slow technical riding, that you're probably going to actually use that mode a lot, and we purposely put it in the middle so that you, like, knowing that if you're going fast, you're probably going to slap the switch all the way up or all the way down, but when you're going slow speed in the rocks, like, you can pay attention and get it to the middle. And that's going to be really good at slow speed driving. So basically what you're going to get is about 3/4 of the pedal travel is going to give you about half of the torque of the engine, and that last portion is going to kind of wick up the curve. And we actually don't allow you to go quite to full power in that rock mode because generally you're not going to need the full 225 horse that you're making out of this engine. And then when you flip it all the way up into race mode, this is where the pedal gets really aggressive. So the instant you're tipping in, it's going to ramp the torque command up, and the engine is going to wake up and push you back in the seat and fly down the trail. So it's a hell of a lot of fun to flip that switch. The one thing to be aware of is as you're driving, you actually have to, like if you flip the switch and you're into the throttle, just take your foot off of it and then get back in, and that's when it'll make the change for you, okay? So as we keep going, other things that you can see on the side of the motor on this cold side, alternators up here in the top. It's got a stretch belt around it, so there's no extra tensioner. The belt is the tensioner itself.
Is it a V or a serpentine?
It's a stretchy serpentine is effectively the way that works. Coming up from here, you can see the starter motor and solenoid are mounted right under the intake manifold. It's a single log style intake, so that is unique to the RZR application as well. Airbox is right here behind the seats, much like a Pro XP. We've actually got the cover removed so you can kind of see what that filter element looks like if you're interested. Let's see, what else have we not talked about on here? Pretty standard suite of sensors on this one. We do have a NOx sensor. We do recommend 91 octane fuel in these. So if somebody's running, bad gas, we do have a sensor on to help protect against that. But you will drop down power if you're not running premium in these rigs. So be aware of that. On the exhaust side, 4-2-1 exhaust with a center mount outlet. Your spark arrestor is built into this tip, so if you're riding in the national forests or anywhere you gotta have a spark arrestor on, obviously the tip looks good, so you'll probably keep it on, but that's where that spark arrestor is located. Doing good so far?
Great.
All right, let's keep going forward on this machine. So next thing we got between the engine and the clutch, there's actually basically an adapter there that allows the clutch to bolt up with that Morse taper. So if you guys look at these clutches, there's a few things that you may notice if you're familiar with previous gen razors. So we've grown the size on both the primary and the secondary. So the diameter of both those clutches is actually enlarged in size versus previous gen models. The other thing that you may notice, and visually maybe not, but we've expanded the center distance. So we used to run 10.5-inch center to center. These are now 12-inch, so we actually run a longer, stronger, wider belt on there. So new part number for the belt, you can probably see it right up at the top right now, but it's a 301-1226 versus the previous turbo belt, which was a 1202. So you will need a new belt if you want to carry a spare or you ever got to replace one. One thing I will tell you for the guys that got their cameras out right now, this isn't a production representative primary. There's one thing that will get added in. There's going to be some stainless slider plates that go on the insides of these towers so that the buttons wear on that versus the aluminum. So when you see them in real life, they'll look slightly different because they'll have like basically a steel plate, a stainless plate with some fasteners coming through each of the towers, all right? The other thing that you can't see looking at the clutch from this side is on the back. There's actually baffle plates on both the primary and the secondary. Where previous gen clutches, we only baffled the secondary. The nice thing about this too is the airflow design. If you look, that the clutch inlet is actually on the passenger side here. So we're drawing air in, feeding it down, and this air, if you look, is actually spaced out, and we're able to flow it into the back side of that stationary sheath. Right, so we're not funneling air right at the belt, but it's actually coming in behind the clutch. And then if you look at that duct that's kind of right next to your hand there, there's actually a hood that's got two openings on the side, which you can see in the unit right behind us here. So we actually run clutch inlet flow down through the spine of the unit, and there's a rubber hose that's off, and that goes right into the movable side of the secondary there. So basically what we're doing is we're flowing more air in with this dual clutch inlet design, and then we're flowing it to get it back to both the stationary and the movable sides of both clutches. So if you think about, where do you really care about heat? It's in the belt itself. So you got to go belt the clutches the air, and get that out. So this new design the guys have is really, really nice actually for moving air around. The other things that you can see just from the overall increase in size, right? The weights are larger. They're bushed weights, so you can kind of see the edges of the bushings and the pin that goes through. The rollers are bigger. Kind of everything about this has been upsized to handle that larger power level, that 225 horse ProStar Fury engine. So pretty nice package on the clutch side overall. The other cool thing here that you see is the spreader tool is built into the inner clutch cover.
I noticed that within the first minute.
Yeah, so you don't have to worry about losing that. The one thing I will tell you guys is that this clutch cover is an older revision. This is not production representative. So if you look, it's got these half-turn toolless fasteners. So the bottom half of this is correct in that it will have this style of fastener, but the top five, like 1, 2, 3, 4, which one is it? It's this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These will actually have like a standard bolt with a nut on the back side. So you do need, a simple wrench or ratchet to be able to pop that clutch cover off if you ever have to do it. But again, it's not hard to do. You pull the two seats out, pull the two back panels out, and you've got basically the access that you see here, other than like this area is filled in with some material. So you kind of have, basically from this frame rail to that frame rail across. So plenty of area to get in there and pop your clutch cover off, and away you go. A couple of the groups have asked if they had guys in service. I think there is a shorter primary clutch puller that doesn't stick out quite as far, so you can access that in the chassis if you got to ever pull a primary off. But it's much like a Pro XP where you can pull the movable off and leave the stationary on, so you don't always need a clutch puller necessarily for most of the maintenance that you got to do over the life of a unit. All right, you got a question?
So
where it has the adapter from the motor to the
Yep.
primary, is it a reduced ratio or is it 1-to-1?
It's 1-to-1. Yep. Yep. It's basically just to space the clutch out so we can drive that air in behind it. Yep.
So no wet clutch or anything like that, right?
Not there. We'll get to that in a couple minutes.
Copy.
Yeah. It's a good reminder because that's the one thing Dave's called me out on twice now.
There's two things going on there, and we haven't explained to the other group there, but there's a PTO adapter that basically spaces, as you said, so it's not all that direct force on the crank.
Yeah.
But we also have a flex plate back there that takes out the engine pulses.
Yeah.
So it's like a standard,
Yeah.
mounted, so it 4-cylinder, 4 pulses per rotation. So those pulses on a 2-cylinder can sometimes affect belt life. So that's been an improvement as well. So
The reason I asked that is Yamaha had a design a few years ago that they had a reduction to their primary clutch like that. So
Yeah, no, it's not like when they had their sleds back in the day.
Right.
Yeah, no, not like that at all. So coming back off the driven, then we got the transmission right here, and this is something that's been confusing to people because they see a picture and they think like, where's the clutch box? Well, it's in the front, right? Because the crank runs front to back or north to south. So this transmission is, I'll say, a pretty standard park reverse, neutral, low, high type gearbox. We do have upgraded gears in there and bearings to handle the additional power. The other thing that I've failed to mention a couple times that Dave's reminded me on when you asked about a wet clutch, there is actually a peak torque limiter in this transmission that goes up to the front drive. So if you look where the prop shaft is coming out, basically right behind that, there's like it's almost like a miniature style motorcycle wet clutch, where you got the stacked steel and friction plates, basically to knock off those torque peaks if somebody doing like a power on landing. The other thing that's unique that you guys can actually see back from this angle, if you look down where the shift cables are coming in, you can see that goes right to this bell crank right here on the back of the transmission. And what you'll notice it's different from most razors is this has got 2 cables going into it. So most razors it's a push-pull cable and a single cable, right? So it kind of comes in and that thing like gets at different angles, so your force changes throughout the stroke. So it always makes it a little harder to put it into park and put it into high versus like shifting between neutral, low, and reverse. So the nice thing about this is because those cables can wrap around that wheel, you always get the same shift effort no matter what gear you're shifting from or to. So it will feel a little bit different when you guys get a chance to go ride. You'll feel that like with the shift lever change and these cables change that it feels a little different than razors you've had in the past. But the nice part is once you get used to it, you nail the gear you want every time and it gives you like a correct feel. But it is different than a previous gen razor in that regard. So just be aware of that when you hop in. That the shifting will feel different, but the force is consistent, so it actually makes it a little easier for you. Coming back from the transmission then, you'll see there's a short drive shaft in the back here. It's about, I don't know, 1.5 feet long. And that feeds into this angle drive in the back end. So as far as operation goes, the back end of this razor is going to work just like you'd expect it to with a lock spool in the back. So anytime that shaft is spinning, both rear shafts are going to power the rear wheels, all right? So there's no, on off. This doesn't have turf. It's basically a locked rear end, driving all the time. When you come out of that transmission, then we've upgraded the shafts so you can see the bar diameter is larger. The shafts or the joints are stronger. We've moved to a high temp grease in the CVs to be able to handle the power. And there's a little bit of a slip spline in those CVs as well to be able to handle the massive wheel travel that we've got on this Pro R. All right, you with me so far? Not a lot of questions. You guys are like quiet and into this. Good, keep up the good work.
Soaking it all in.
We'll get to that.
we'll get there.
All right, so as we go out the front of the transmission then, you'll see there's a massive prop shaft running up to the front. And that diameter of that thing's, yay big around, like 3 inches or so. The cool thing is that it's a hollow shaft, so it's really strong because all the force is carried on the outside of it. But that runs all the way up to the front end of this vehicle. Now, the one thing I will have to tell you guys is that we actually have the wrong front drive in this particular model because it was an earlier build. If you look at any of the other Pro Rs that are around here, I believe they should have the correct front drive in them. But we talked about it a little bit as far as operation goes. But I think the thing for you guys to be aware of, especially if you're more technical guys, is any previous gen razor, if you didn't have power to the front drive, it like defaults to 2-wheel drive. It's different on this one that if you don't power the front end, it will default to the unlocked front diff state. Meaning you'll basically have both rear wheels and one of the front wheels driving, and then we have to power one solenoid to put it into 2-wheel drive, basically to disconnect the front end, and we power a different one to fully lock the front end. So it's a little different in how that operates. And like we turn that stuff off if you're in park or neutral, so we're not wasting power. So basically if the engine's running and you're in low, high, or reverse is when it's gonna engage the proper solenoids. And when you're not, like if you're parked or the key is off, we turn all that stuff off. So you may have like you're switching 2-wheel drive, but the machine is actually in that, you know, 4-wheel drive unlocked front diff state. So just be aware of that because it's a little different than what guys are maybe used to. Cool thing about it is, you know, 2-wheel drive is going to operate just like any other RZR you've ever been in. You know, both back wheels are spinning, fronts are along for the ride. When you flip that switch to the middle, which is probably the mode that a lot of people are going to use fairly frequently for like trail riding, it's going to give you one of the 2 front wheels, so you're still going to get pretty light steering effort. And it's a 1-to-1 ratio now too, which is different. And then when you flip that switch all the way up to the topmost position, that's going to give you a fully locked front end and 1-to-1. So all 4 wheels are spinning at exactly the same speed. So for you guys that are running rocks or doing real technical work, like you're going to love the front drive on this unit with that full diff lock mode up in the front end, because it's really handy, and that 1-to-1 really allows you to track the way you want to go. So, you know, sometimes on older models or competitive units, you'll see guys that like aren't going straight up. They're kind of like this, and they gas it and the back end swings down and points you straight up the hill. This will actually much better allow you to track and traverse the line you're trying to take. So feel free to try that out. And again, as Dave mentioned, when you guys are out riding, like basically come to a stop and try the different modes to make sure it actually clicks through, because I don't know what version of software we have on some of these. It may not indicate to you right away. So, you know, for today, just come to a stop. It is electronically locked out, so if you flip it, like it just won't change until you get to a spot where you're going slow enough that it will automatically. So yeah, then coming up to the front, again, same story on the front half shafts. Bars are increased, high temp grease in the joints, and upgraded joints. So, you know, if we kind of think, right, we talk power, strength, and control. When you think power, right, engine's new, clutch is new, transmission's new, rear drive's new, shafts are new, front drive's new. Like everything on this drive line has been upgraded and updated to handle the bigger power of the Pro R. Making sense?
Copy.
All right. Copy? All right, it's good. All right, so let's move on to strength. So this is kind of the second pillar that we talk about when we're talking Pro Rs. And the cool thing is on this unit that we've taken all the plastic off, you can see a little bit more on some of the stuff going on. And the biggest one that people will clue into is the fact that this is a one-piece mainframe. So if you look at most other RZRs, you're gonna find a joint, you know, kind of somewhere in this area. And the cool thing is we actually had a big upgrade to our powder coating line down at the manufacturing plant to be able to support the larger one-piece sections through the manufacturing process now. So not only is the 2-seater a one-piece frame, but the 4-seaters are as well. And then the other thing, when you look at the top of this roll cage now is a fully welded one-piece cage. So this will ship from the factory with the cage bolted on. That's not part of what you guys will do from a setup perspective, which means that the logistics cost is a little higher. So just make sure you're paying attention to that as you guys are thinking about you know, how you deal with freight charges. But the cool thing about the cage, number one, is that it's got big beefy 2-inch tubing. You know, this thing's made of high strength alloys. It's all gusseted up. But when you get to the back, for you guys that are familiar with clutch joints, if you look at the B and C pillars here, the cage basically looks like the end of an engine with the taper on it, and the mainframe itself almost looks like a primary clutch that accepts that Morse taper. And then there's a single bolt that runs up through the middle, so we get a really strong connection here at the B and C pillars. On a 4-seater, it'd be the C and D, the back 2 points. The front A pillar is the same kind of, you know, offset forging that you're used to seeing with a pair of bolts going through it.
Still redesigned though.
Well, yeah, still redesigned. So it's a newer, bigger casting on the Pro R versus what you've seen in the past, for sure. And the other nice thing about these, and you can actually see it on this unit where we've got, you know, the nice titanium cage and the black mainframe, because we've got like the rubber covering up the A pillars and where the body lines are in the back, you can actually have a colored cage and a black chassis, and you really don't see it because of where those joints are. So like if you look behind you at that Pro R Launch Edition, you know, it's got the nice lime squeeze paint, that beautiful red cage on top. You know, you don't notice the fact that the mainframe is black even with the red cage on there. So it's a pretty cool deal from the strength side. Obviously, we talked about a lot of the driveline updates from a strength side, right? We got the beefed up shafts and joints, you know, the big prop shaft on this sucker, the gear cases that are redesigned, transmission, front drive, all that stuff, along with that peak torque limiter that Dave made sure I remembered this time. Thanks, Dave. And when we come up front, the other one that's super visual is when you start looking at the suspension on this Pro R. The cool thing here is that these stamped and formed arms are super beefy, like they're really strong and you can actually see it. But the cool thing is with this shock now coming down to the lower control arm, basically all the force from the suspension goes to the arm that the shock is mounted to, right? Well, it turns out the lower arm is also the thing that you're going to be most prone to hitting trail debris, right? So whether that's a rock, a root, a stump, whatever. So the nice thing is this lower arm is built super strong to be able to handle the suspension loads, which means it's better at, you know, any type of trail debris that you might come across as well. And it allows us to put a little less weight in that upper A arm where you don't necessarily need to be carrying the weight around. As you go out to the wheel end from the strength perspective, the other cool things that you'll see here, it's a little hard to see, but you might kind of be able to see like down inside the knuckle there. We've actually got a unitized hub on these. So we've got a 5-bolt rim now on that hub, which you can see if you look at the outside of any of these. It's a 5x4.5 or 114.3 millimeter, depending on, you know, which unit system you're used to thinking in. But with that unitized hub, the bearings in the hub are built as one assembly. So the nice thing, if any of you ever worked on a car that's got unitized hubs, they're really easy to replace because you don't have to mess around like pressing a bearing out and pressing a bearing back in. You basically just pop it out, put a new assembly in. And the half shaft torque on that nut, you also don't have to, you're not using that to seat the wheel bearings anymore. So the torque on the nut on the half shaft is quite a bit lower than what it's been in past models, which actually helps improve the bearing life on these from what you guys may have seen in past model razors. So a heck of a lot of strength improvements there. The other cool one that you see looking through the wheel is there's a top hat rotor on the brake design. So if you guys look down at the brake disc, what you'll see is the outside where the pads grab is actually made out of steel, but inside that is actually an aluminum portion. So we can take some weight out of that wheel end while still getting the strength and heat rejection we need out of the brakes. This thing's also got some huge 3-piston calipers in the front and duals in the rear, so the brakes on this are really, really nice. And we tend not to get any of the knockback that you may have experienced over time in a Turbo S, so the pedal's always there for you. You don't have to like seat the brakes first and then get back into it. So it's a really nice design in that regard. The other thing that you'll see up front here, if you look kind of through the side of the vehicle, you know, just past the wheels, the power steering unit is now integrated in with the rack and pinion assembly. So that allows us to drop some of the weight down, integrate that system in, and we don't have to have an extra lower steering shaft anymore. The other cool thing we'll talk about in a few minutes is that we've got some new control algorithms that actually pair the steering assist with the shocks for the Dynamics DV system as well. So from the control side that we'll get to in a bit, that becomes really key. Other things on the strength side that you'll notice on the suspension, we've actually got a 3-piece stabilizer bar now, so you can kind of see this aluminum arm coming to the drop length and then a separate steel bar that's going across the front of the chassis. So it's a splined end there. The rear is the same way. One of the questions that we often get asked is why is the drop length so big in the back going down to the trailing arm? And the reality is it's so that we can package the stabilizer bar above the clutch cover. So if you look right in here, kind of behind the driver's seat is where the tightest spot is, but that's the reason that stab bar is up that high, is to package over all the engine and clutches that kind of get in the way with this north-south crank configuration. Continuing back on the strength side, obviously you can see just how big the shocks are on these rigs. Who's stealing a razor? I hope I know that guy. But when you come back, obviously you can see the trailing arms are built plenty beefy, right? Full stamped and formed, welded all the way across. When you get back to the back end, you can see the huge radius rods, lower clearance in the rear, or high clearance in the rear on the lower bar, I'm sorry. And you can just see like how thick the steel structure is on all the trailing arm back in the back, right? It's basically like 1/4-inch steel that's built on everything in that wheel end. The other thing that's easy to see in the back are these huge 14mm fasteners. So these are used throughout the suspension. They're up on the front arms, they're in the back on the radius rods, they're all over the trailing arms. But if you think in English units, right, that's bigger than a 1/2-inch bolt now, holding all the suspension together. So just get your 21mm wrench tuned up because you're going to need that instead of the old 19 that you're maybe used to on a lot of the other fasteners on previous razors. So when you think about strength, right, again, mainframe's beefed up, the cage is stronger, suspension's way stronger, you know, shocks are bigger, everything about this thing is like made to handle the power and performance that we got here. All right, I gotta take a breath. Short drink of water. You guys all following along still? All right, questions have been short, so let's move on to control next. So when you think about control, the easy way to think about this is anything the vehicle's doing or what you're touching and feeling from the driver's seat, right? So we'll start out on suspension since we're standing in the back and it's the easiest thing to see. We got huge 3-inch bore shocks in the back. This is an ultimate trim, so this has actually got the internal bypass shocks from Fox with the Dynamics DV, which stands for dual valve. Easy way to see that is if you look at the top of these shocks, you'll actually see there's a compression valve and a separate rebound valve in here. So there's 2 spots that wires are connecting up to the top of these shocks. Fronts are the same, you know, just in a different location. Now the cool thing about this this shock setup, number one, is the internal bypass mechanical shock is really, really nice. And are you guys like suspension experts or not? Not really, maybe a little.
Depends on the day.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll run through what the hell is an internal bypass shock and why do you care first. So the cool thing, if you were able to look inside this shock, there's actually like the lower rod is connected to a piston, right? That goes up and down in the shock. Well, there's actually another tube inside this outer body that you can't see in an internal bypass shock. So the way that works is that there's a piston inside an inner tube, and then that's encapsulated with this outer tube. And oil can flow effectively around the piston or bypass the piston because there's some holes drilled along the inside of that inner tube, all right? Now, some of them have check valves, so they only operate in one way versus the other. But what that allows us to do is basically get really plush motion and really comfortable ride when you're just hitting those little chatter bumps. And then as you start stroking that shock up, it's gonna get stiffer and stiffer as it moves up in that compression stroke, okay? So the biggest thing that we run into or we hear about people complaining is they'll take a machine that's got internal bypass shocks like a Turbo S today, they'll load it down with all their friends, all their accessories, all their gear, spare parts, their cooler, and all of a sudden now they took their stock machine that rode really well and they go, this thing's riding really stiff, like what's going on? Well, what's happening there is they're dropping the suspension down, they're compressing it too much, and they're getting out of that supple ride zone into like one of those more, I'll say harder zones, if you will. And basically all you got to do is crank enough preload back in to get it back to the stock ground clearance setting. Okay, so on an internal bypass shock, like what we have on the Ultimates, that's actually really important that you get them set up with the weight that people are going to ride with. So especially on a 4-seater where you can carry more people, more stuff, more accessories, that is one thing that you want to pay attention to and get dialed in for that person, especially if they're new to it. Moving on to the Dynamics DV side though, this is where a lot of the magic actually happens on these Ultimates. And the cool thing is the compression and rebound are fully independently controlled. So what that means is we can add compression and rebound, we can take them both away, or we can move them in different directions. So competitive models that have compression and rebound, they're kind of coupled together. So if they add one, they're taken away from the other and vice versa. Whereas on this, we can move them both the same direction or independently, which makes for some cool stuff that we can actually do with it. So we talked just a little bit before about what the 4 modes are. So on previous models, right, we had Comfort, Sport, and Firm. Well, now we have Comfort, Track, Rock, and Baja. And the cool thing is we've taken a lot of the lessons that we've learned over the years and applied them here. So like if you jump in an old XP Turbo with Dynamics from 3-4 years ago and you throw it into a corner, it's basically just going to stiffen up the outside wheels and leave the insides alone. When we got the Pro XP, we actually add now, like you throw it into a corner, we stiffen up the outside and we soften the inside to help keep that body flat. So that's why Pro XPs almost feel like they're a wider machine than they are. So we still do some of that goodness here, but we've actually added on as well. And the cool thing is in each of these modes, they run a little different, and we can now actually control not only the shocks, but the power steering as well. So when you start out all the way down in that comfort mode, which I'd recommend when you guys first take off, you'll notice that you get really light, easy steering feel, and the shocks are just free flowing. So when you look at, if you have your screen on that dynamic setting, you'll actually see that there's basically 0 compression, 0 rebound, so that those wheels can just freely move over the terrain, right? And when you're trail cruising or going slow, like that's exactly what you want to have happen. So it's really nice. It's going to give you the most comfort, but it's not meant for going 80 miles an hour through deep ruts or big whoops, right? When you step up to the next setting on the track mode, then we're actually going to suck the ride height of the vehicle down a little bit, and we're gonna add some compression, we're gonna add some rebound, and when you throw it into corners, we're gonna react a little faster to try and keep that body as flat as possible. So when I talked about like stiffening the outside and dropping the inside, we're gonna do that on this machine as rapidly as possible. And on the steering assist, we're actually gonna drop the assist down a little bit to give you a little more front tire feedback. So it's gonna feel like a little heavier steering, but the wheels are gonna feel more like they're in your hand in the steering wheel in that track mode. Nice way to think about this one, if you're running like high-speed gravel or areas that don't have a lot of big bumps, you know, it's maybe just little chatter bumps. Think of things like dunes where it's pretty smooth, or, you know, going in like a short course race. That track mode is going to be your best friend. When you go up from there, the rock mode is really meant for slow speed technical riding. So in that mode, we're going to do a couple things. Number one, we're going to try and give you the most ground clearance you can get by dropping the rebound down and cranking the compression up a little bit. And we're going to give you the easiest assist on the steering, because we know that, you know, you get into some tight spots and you want to be able to really maneuver around. And that mode's going to be good up to about 15 miles an hour. And then after that, we're going to transition most of the maps to act like they're in comfort. So if you're going fast, you'll notice that comfort and rock feel pretty much the same, because they are pretty much the same. But the other cool thing that we do in the rock mode, and it's unique to that mode, is that we actually change the attitude of the vehicle. So when you start going up an incline or down something, we're actually going to try and lean the machine into the hill. So if you think about that, like you're going, you know, straight up a slope, we're actually going to drop the ground clearance on the front and try and increase it on the back to give you the most stability you can get in that scenario. And that'll work kind of in any direction you're going, but it's easiest for people to understand, like going straight up or straight down, right? And obviously whatever the high side is the one that gets leaned down, and the bottom side is the one that gets leaned up, if you will. And then in Baja mode, which is the fourth one, in that mode, we're going to kind of give you a mix of steering, so you're going to have good front end feel, but we're actually going to bias the front end of the machine to be nose light in the front. So we're actually going to put a little bit of rebound back into that to let the tires fall out. But when you're going, that's going to be the mode when you're thinking of like going through those 3-foot whoops. Like Baja's the mode you want to be in. So when you guys get out of this campsite, there's a trail you'll hit maybe, I don't know, a mile from here that's got some nice ruts and whoops through it. Like try out Baja mode when you're going through there. And you'll pretty quickly just be giddy like a kid and have a smile on your face, because it makes almost no good sense how good this thing is in that terrain. So the other thing, you got the red X button on the side. Anytime you hold that down, it's going to take all 4 corners to full compression. So easy way to think about that is if you're going, you know, fast and you see something coming up that you can't slow down enough for, push that, hold it down until you get through it, and then let go. The other place it actually comes in really handy is when you're doing slow speed technical riding, like in rocks. If you're going to like drop off a shelf and you know that you got, you know, a couple feet to drop down before you hit, it can actually be nice to hold that, pop through it, and then go back into whatever mode you were in. So that's another area to think about that. The other features that I didn't mention that are kind of across the different modes on the new Dynamics DV, the first one is a pitch control. So if you look at our previous gen stuff, anytime you hit the brakes, we add compression to the front end. But on the rear end, the only time we'll do an anti-squat is like if you're at a dead stop and you mash the gas, we'll firm up the back to try and keep the back end from squatting down so bad. On these Pro Rs now and the Turbo Rs, we'll actually do that anti-dive, anti-squat anytime you're hitting the brakes or getting on the throttle. So even when you're trail riding and getting on off the gas, we'll basically be trying to anti-dive or anti-squat to keep the body level for you front to back all the time. And again, that stuff gets coupled. So like if you're braking going into a corner and then accelerating, right, we're doing like an anti-dive, a cornering, and an anti-squat like real time as you're going through those events. So you'll notice it when you drive, it just in how stable these vehicles feel because of that technology. And then the other cool one we've got is landing stabilization mode. So as you're going, if you get into the airborne condition, we're actually going to drop all 4 wheels out as fast as possible. And then when you land, you're going to be at full compression. So we're going to suck that hit and then try to keep you from bouncing by adjusting compression and rebound. So like you guys have either seen videos or experienced it where you're going through something and all of a sudden you feel a little light and the machine kind of does this as you go. Well, now you're going to kind of get that lightness, you're going to come down and it's going to dampen right out and you'll be off on your way. So it's really nice in that regard with some of the new control technology that's in the Dynamics DV system. Other things that are cool, obviously we got ride command built into this rig. So from a controls perspective, you guys are probably used to most of the features there. You got customizable gauges when you go through the first screen on the mapping. I'll encourage you guys to be doing group riding today. If you want to try sending messages to the other people in the group, you know, it's not hard to do. And, you know, this has got actually older software in it, but what's in some of the vehicles you guys will be using, you know, you'll get that full chat history that almost looks like a text message on your phone. There's also different zoom options for your group ride. I don't know if you guys have ever used those or not, but if you look at the left side, you'll see a plus minus, and then there'll be like a hollow circle and some filled in ones. So you can have zoom to group, you can have zoom to leader, and you can choose whether that's the person right in front of you or the person at the front of the pack. So it'll dynamically resize that map for you as you go, so you can always see where you are and where they are. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize with how the group ride technology works is that the range that you get is only limited by the length between you and the nearest machine in your group. It's not necessarily the machine in the front and the one all the way in the back. So you guys will be out, 5 machines plus a lead chase, so say 7 razors, right? So if you look with how dusty it's going to be, you guys are going to be spread out for like miles, probably 10 miles, I would guess, if you're not wanting to eat dust all day. And the cool thing is, so you got a razor every 2-3 miles. The guy in the front, his signal will actually piggyback through each razor until it gets to the back, so you can see where everybody in the group is and be able to send those group messages. So cool tech there for sure. Another one that a lot of people don't realize is like when you're running, this one doesn't have a rear camera, so it doesn't work very well to showcase it here. But if you hit this Polaris start button, you can actually turn your reverse camera on and use it like a rear view mirror. Which I'll do a lot just to see, like, hey, our headlights behind me when I'm riding at night, just to know, yeah, that guy's, a quarter mile back or whatever, without having to crank my head around or look down. The other one too that a lot of people aren't aware of, when you look at the left-hand side of the steering wheel on how the ride command controls work over there, the volume up and down are pretty self-explanatory, right? But the play pause button, there's some people that don't realize that, like, if you're listening to the radio and you got your volume, turned on to whatever, if you just hit that play pause button, it'll actually mute the audio for you. So you don't have to hold the down button down to get it to go off. And then if you hit it again, it'll come right back to whatever level you left it at. So just be aware of that if you guys didn't know about that. And then the Polaris Star button comes from the factory, not configured. And you can actually choose what you want that button to do. So I tend to like it where I've got it as a short press. We'll toggle through the displays. So if you just tap that Polaris Star button, you'll see that it'll start flipping through gauge screens. And then I usually set it up where a long press will drop a waypoint for me. But if you go into the settings menu here and down to your vehicle, you'll actually see one that says steering wheel shortcut button. And there's, I think, another option or two you can actually choose in here now. But if you're a big music guy, maybe you want to skip to the next track and you can set it up to do that. So just be aware that this can be configured to however you prefer it to be. And it's not just a random button that doesn't do anything. Because some people question that sometimes because they're not aware. Other things on the control side, obviously we talked about shocks, we talked about steering, we've talked ride command. We got the built-in audio from Rockford on this unit. Tweeters would be up here in the A-pillar and the main drivers in the dash. Obviously on 4-seaters you get the rear speakers as well.